Council on Foreign Relations is probably the most influential organisation in the United States today. Since its formation, it has had the highest influence in shaping American foreign policy. Its members have filled important government roles since the Second World War, and its foreign affairs publication is perhaps the most influential publication in shaping the minds of American foreign policy planners, and has large financial backing from the most powerful banks, corporations and oligarchs in the United States. In Wall Street's think tank, the author Lawrence Schaup writes, what David Rothkopf, who is himself a council member, calls the superclass and Davos man, the 6,000 individuals that he says runs the world, has its main base in the Council on Foreign Relations. The 2014 annual report from the Council brags that, quote, CFO's members are, and always have been, its most valuable asset, a pillar of the institution's strength and an indication of its influence. The roster today counts 2 former US presidents and 2 vice presidents. There have been a total of 7 of each in the CFO's history, 26 Pulitzer Prize winners, 9 Nobel laureates, 96 Rhodes Scholars, 52 leaders of Fortune 500 companies, 42 special envoys, and 62 admirals and generals in the US Armed Forces. Since CFO's founding, 30 Secretaries of State have served as members. While serving as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton once admitted in a speech that the CFO gives her instructions on, quote, what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the Council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
Since its formation, the CFO has existed to turn the foreign affairs interests of Wall Street bankers and other American oligarchs into US policy, and has played a leading role in transforming the United States into a globe-spanning empire. The CFO has 2 categories of membership, individual and corporate. Individual membership to the Council is by invite only. Potential members must be recommended by a current CFO member and be seconded by 3 other individuals, preferably also Council members. Aside from individual membership, another key part of the CFO is its Corporation Service Programme. For corporations that by annual subscription become corporate members of the Council. Corporate membership exists at 3 levels. The founders pay $100,000 a year to the Council, the President's Circle pays $75,000 a year, and the affiliates pay $40,000. As of 2021, the list of founders, who are the most prominent corporate members, are as follows: Accenture, AT&T, Bank of America, BlackRock, Chevron, Cisco, Citibank, ExxonMobil, Facebook, Google, Goldman Sachs, Hess, HP, Moody's, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Nasdaq and PepsiCo. Among the President's Circle and affiliates are corporations like Blackstone, Bloomberg, PayPal, Shell, Warburg Pincus, the arms manufacturer Lockheed Martin, United Airlines, the US Chamber of Commerce, Boeing, TikTok and American Express. It's evident from this list that the CFO represents the highest level of the global capitalist superclass. So let's take a brief look at the history of the Council on Foreign Relations and how it became so influential. In May 1919, at the Majestic Hotel in Paris, a group of Americans and British agreed to form an Anglo-American organization. It was officially named the Institute of International Affairs, and it was to have branches in both the United Kingdom and the United States. The conception of the scheme was primarily devised by the British historian Lionel Curtis, formerly a colonial official in South Africa and an advocate for federalism for the British Empire, who later in his life became an advocate for a world state. For the previous 9 years, Curtis had been in charge of setting up a network of semi-secret organisations in the British Dominions and the United States. These bodies, called the Round Table Groups, were established by Lord Milner, a former British Secretary of State for War, and his associates in 1908 to 1911. The Round Table Groups published, beginning in 1910, the magazine The Round Table, with anonymous contributors and even an anonymous editorial board. During the First World War, Round Table leaders were important in the formulation of British war aims and many came to Paris as part of the British delegation. At the same time, a group of about 150 scholars called the Inquiry was tasked to brief President Woodrow Wilson about options for the post-war world when Germany was defeated. The head of research was Walter Lippmann, today known for coining the term Cold War and inventing the word stereotype, and his successor, Isaiah Bowman. This team produced more than 2,000 documents dealing with and analysing the political, economic and social facts globally that would be helpful for Wilson in peace talks, and these later served as the basis for Wilson's 14 points, which were to serve as the basis for the post-war order. Attending the conference, the group of planners met separately with members of the British delegation and decided to continue the inquiry by forming a permanent Anglo-American Institute of International Affairs with 2 branches, one in each country. The British group formed what became the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which still exists today and is known more popularly as Chatham House. However, the plan floundered on the American side, largely due to the isolationist mood of the American public after the war. The scholars turned their attention to a small club of elite businessmen called the Council on Foreign Relations. Established in 1918, the New York Club had only 108 members, mostly high-ranking Wall Street financiers and international lawyers. Its original aim was to explore the effect of the war upon business and promote commerce. Its means were networking conferences and dinners hosting prominent foreign visitors. The scholars from the Inquiry saw in the club a shared interest in internationalism and an opportunity to unite government planners with academics and bankers and other large capitalists to better plan the direction of American foreign policy. This new version of the council had a 15-man board of directors and an honorary president in the person of Republican Elihu Root, the leading Wall Street lawyer of the era. Early members of the council board included investment bankers Otto Kahn, representing Cohen-Loeb, and Paul Warburg, representing Warburg and Company, and the former chairman of the Federal Reserve. J.P. Morgan Chase was also represented. One of the first achievements of the council was the publication of the Foreign Affairs Journal. The first issue was published in September 1922. The council reported in 1924 that, quote, Foreign Affairs has established itself as the most authoritative American review dealing with international relations. Once the Foreign Affairs Journal was well established, the Council began to focus more on organising research programs to provide plans and solutions to America's planners. To quote from the book Imperial War Trust, another book on the CFR by Lawrence Shoup, he writes that, quote, the Council provided a forum where leaders from these 3 key sectors of American life could meet and reach a consensus. Usually, more than 20 men met and discussed a problem approximately monthly for a year or more. Their conclusions about the direction of American foreign policy were often communicated to government officials, formally or informally. In the case of a study group, one member of the group took responsibility for writing an article or book, which was to represent personal views rather than a consensus, but which was understood to result largely from the work and thinking of the group. Shoup continues that, quote, it is not difficult to find the reason for the Council's interest in the world and in an expansionist American foreign policy. The Council, dominated by corporate leaders, saw expansion of American trade, investment, and population as the solution to domestic problems. It thought in terms of preservation of the status quo at home, and this involved overseas expansion. As Bowman, that is Isaiah Bowman, a geographer who was influential on the Council and who had been part of the inquiry, put it in 1928, foreign raw materials, imports and exports were necessary, quote, if we are to avoid crisis in our constantly expanding industries. Since the era of cheap land was over and population was increasing, Eastern social and industrial problems cannot be resolved in the historical manner by a flow of population to another region. Thus the United States had to increase its exports, quote, sell something abroad in greater degree, if not wheat or maize, then steel or copper. Bowman and the CFR concluded that a more activist foreign policy was necessary. The problem for the Council, representing American oligarchical interests, was that Americans in the interwar years were massively in favour of an isolationist foreign policy and economic nationalism. The trend toward economic nationalism in America initiated the Great Debate of the 1930s over national self-sufficiency. The dispute, in the words of Foreign Affairs editor Hamilton Fish Armstrong, quote, set the tone of American policy for the next 10 years and resulted in the sweeping political and economic reorientation of American foreign policy. Again, quoting the book The Imperial Brain Trust, quote, "The Council counterattack against high tariffs, possible government control of foreign trade, and central economic planning began with the 1932 Foreign Affairs article by Council Secretary-Treasury Edwin F. Gay on the Great Depression. Ignoring the shortcomings of laissez-faire capitalism as a cause of the Depression, Gay focused on the international causes of the economic crisis and concluded that economic self-sufficiency was impossible. A time must come when the United States, as a powerful world state and a great creditor nation, hence vitally interested in world trade and world prosperity, will face the realities of its new position. It will realize that a policy of self-sufficiency is not only impossible, but that a policy which presupposes it to be possible is stultifying and impoverishing. To say, as one frequently hears it said, that because the value of American exports is less than 10% of the total American production, we may therefore go our own way regardless of foreign trade or international responsibilities, is to misinterpret the plain facts. The whole network of domestic prices and domestic credit in the United States is bound indissolubly with the system of world prices and with the stream of world credit. A dislocation anywhere in the fabric is now felt everywhere. The World War affirmed the international political responsibilities of the United States. The World Depression demonstrates the economic interdependence of the United States with other states. It cannot be a hermit nation. The Council followed this article with a 1933 discussion group on the subject, aimed at influencing the newly elected administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt in an internationalist direction. And it was during the Roosevelt administration that the Council first began to penetrate the United States government. By the late 1930s, the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation had begun heavily funding the Council as they began the push to transform the United States into a global empire. The Council reached its historic peak up to that point with its work on setting US war aims during the Second World War. This war and the subsequent Cold War were decisive events, marking the turning point towards full-blown US imperialism and beginning a process of organising the global political economy in a top-down fashion with the United States as the hegemonic power. A process that had been the aspiration of the oligarchs and major foundations for years prior. In 1939, the Council organised a seminar for junior executives to provide what it called some understanding of the broad implications of American foreign policy. There was 26 firms present, among them the Federal Reserve Bank, General Motors, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Price Waterhouse and Sullivan and Cromwell. During the war, the Council established a special study group called the War Peace Studies. The aim of this vast undertaking, which the Rockefeller Foundation alone gave $300,000 in a 6-year period, was to directly influence the government's foreign policy during the war. Almost 100 men worked on the effort, engaging in organisation, research, analysis and writing from 1939 to 1945. They produced a total of 682 memoranda for President Roosevelt, the State Department and other branches of the US government. After the war, the UN Founding Conference took place in San Francisco in 1945. More than 40 of the American delegates attending were CFR members. Using an $8.5 million gift from John D. Rockefeller Jr., the UN purchased land on New York's East River for its headquarters. Setting the framework for the post-war order had begun with the War Peace Studies in 1939, but in 1945 this was to rapidly accelerate with the death of President Roosevelt, who was succeeded by Harry Truman. As discussed in my last video on national security and double government, Truman was more responsible than any man for creating the modern national security apparatus, including the NSA, the National Security Council, and the CIA. In a renowned book called The Wise Men by Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas, they profile 6 statesmen whose careers peaked during the Truman era, who are profiled as what the book calls the architects of the American century, who, quote, left a legacy that dominates American policy to this day. These were Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, Robert Lovett, who was the Under-Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, Averell Harriman, who occupied various positions in the cabinet, John McCloy, who was the High Commissioner to Germany, George Kennan, who was a State Department advisor and the ambassador to the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and Charles Bolin, who was a State Department advisor. Amazingly, all 6 of these men were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council continued to shape American foreign policy during the Cold War. For example, in the 1950s, the Council had no less than 5 different study groups focused on Southeast Asia, and in 1963, the Council published a book called Southeast Asia in United States Policy, stating that the area was of great strategic, economic, and demographic significance, of special significance in the world balance because of the importance of its raw materials and markets. Dwight D. Eisenhower had chaired a CF4 study group while he served as the president of Columbia University. The CF4 study group devised an expanded study group called Americans for Eisenhower to increase his chances for the presidency. On taking office, Eisenhower appointed one of the most prominent CF4 members, John Foster Dulles, as Secretary of State. His brother Allen Dulles served as the first civilian head of the CIA from 1953 to 61, and together they orchestrated many of the overseas coups and military interventions that marked America's transition into an empire, including coups in Iran and Guatemala over popular leaders. The 1970s marked a shift where the Council began to integrate the new rich of American society. In the 1960s and 70s, the top leadership of the CF4 was still dominated by members of the old capitalist class and had a large representation from America's richest old plutocratic families. For example, a quick review of the Council's 1970 annual reports finds members of the Rockefeller family and also top men from the Morgan, DuPont, Mellon, Schiff, Guggenheim and Dillon families. The old WASP aristocracy became less prominent as cosmopolitan internationalists who had entered the American capitalist class began to play more of a leading role. David Rockefeller, more than anyone else, was responsible for this integration of the new rich into the ruling class. The penetration of the CF4 into government expanded as the Cold War progressed. By the time of the Carter administration in the 1970s, all 12 of his top foreign policymakers were CF4 members at some time in their careers. Walter Mondale, his vice president, his first Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, they were all long-term members and directors of the CF4 prior to holding their offices. And Vance was vice chairman of the Council for a number of years. Carter's Secretary of the Treasury, Michael Blumenthal, and G. William Miller, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, CIA Director Stansfield Turner, and World Bank head Robert S. McNamara were all longtime members of the CF4 prior to taking office, and Brown and Blumenthal also served as directors. The Reagan administration was no better. During his 8 years in office, Reagan had a total of 6 national security advisors. 2 had been in the CF4 prior to taking office, and 3 others later became CF4 members. Both of Reagan's CIA directors, William J. Casey and William H. Webster, were longtime CF4 members. Reagan was succeeded by former CIA Director George H.W. Bush, who had been a CF4 member and director prior to becoming vice president under Reagan. During his own presidency, 10 of his 11 top foreign policymakers were council members, and 4 had also been council directors. Both of Bush's Secretaries of State, James A. Baker and Lawrence S. Eagleburger, were in the CF4. Secretary of the Treasury, Nicholas F. Brady, was a member of the Council prior to taking office, as was Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, who had also been a director. Lewis T. Preston and Robert M. Gates, World Bank and CIA heads respectively, were also members prior to taking office. 15 of Clinton's top 17 foreign policy officials were members of the Council, and 5 had also been, or were soon to be, directors. Bill Clinton was himself a CF4 member before he became president. Both of his Secretaries of State, Warren Christopher and Madeleine Albright, were longtime members. Clinton appointed 3 directors of the CIA, who were all members of the CF4. R. James Woolsey and John M. Deutsch were longtime members when appointed, and the third, George Tenet, became a member about the same time he became the head of the CIA. Then there was Clinton's World Bank president, James Wolfensohn, and 2 of his 3 secretaries of the Treasury. Robert Rubin and Lawrence Summers were members, with Rubin later becoming a director and co-chair of the Council. George W. Bush was never himself a member of the CF4, but 14 of the 17 top foreign policy officials he appointed were, or had once been Council members. His Vice President, Dick Cheney, was a long-time member and was twice a director. Both of Bush's Secretaries of State, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, had been longtime members of the council when they were appointed, and Powell became a CFR director in 2006, right after leaving government. Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense during the Iraq War, was a member of the council in the 1970s. Of the 17 top foreign policy makers in the Obama administration, a total of 11 had been CFR members, with the exception of one, all prior to joining the Obama government, including all three of Obama's national security advisors, James L. Jones Jr., Thomas E. Donnellan, and Susan Rice. Despite promising to drain the swamp, Trump's cabinet also had its share of CFR members, including National Security Advisor John Bolton, Elliott Abrams, Director of the National Economic Council Gary Cohn, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Jerome Powell, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And his successor Joe Biden's cabinet is absolutely filled with CFR members, including Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, Alejandro Mayorkas, Homeland Security, William J. Burns, the CIA Director, Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the Ambassador to the UN, Gina Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce, Cecilia Rouse, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, John Kerry, the Special Envoy for Climate, Tom Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture, and Susan Rice, the White House Domestic Policy Council Director. Now, one interesting thing is that since 1970, the Council has only been chaired by a handful of people. The leadership has been remarkably stable. Between 1970 and 2007, there were only two chairs, David Rockefeller and Peter G. Peterson. From 2007 to 2017, there was two co-chairs, Robert Rubin and Carla A. Hills. And since 2017, the chair has been David Rubenstein. To get a better understanding of what kind of people are chosen to lead the council, I'll briefly profile these individuals. Firstly, Peter G. Peterson was an American investment banker who served as the US Secretary of Commerce from 1972 to 1973 under the Richard Nixon administration. And from 73 to 84, he was chairman and CEO of Lehman Brothers. Later in 1985, he founded the private equity firm, the Blackstone Group, and served as its chairman, becoming a billionaire. Peterson's entry into the super elite began in the 1960s when he became friends with David Rockefeller. And David Rockefeller was the other chair during this time. David Rockefeller was the son of John D. Rockefeller and as such was part of one of the richest families in history. Raised in the most expensive house in New York, he served as the chairman and the chief executive of Chase Manhattan Corporation, and David points out that he learned the neoliberal free market economic philosophy at an early date. The Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek tutored him at the London School of Economics in the late 1930s. Rockefeller was a member of the CFR from 1949 until his death in 2017. In 1973, he helped found the Trilateral Commission, another big globalist organization. And during his time leading the CFR, Rockefeller often travelled to meet other world leaders to represent the interests of the American ruling class, including a 1977 trip to China where Rockefeller was keen to secure a top position for Chase Bank in that country. With oil interests in the Middle East, he often travelled for official meetings with the likes of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Nasser and Sadat of Egypt, and Saddam Hussein of Iraq, giving and taking messages back to President Nixon and the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. In 1979, while still chairman of the CFR, Rockefeller became embroiled in an international incident when himself, Henry Kissinger and John J. McCloy persuaded President Jimmy Carter to admit the Shah of Iran into the US for hospital treatment. And this directly precipitated what became known as the Iran hostage crisis, as the Iranian regime took it as a sign of an impending coup d'etat and accelerated anti-American rhetoric. Both Nixon and Carter asked Rockefeller to serve as Treasury Secretary, and Carter wanted to appoint him as Federal Reserve Board Chairman, but Rockefeller declined all of these requests, preferring to exercise power outside of government. Throughout his time on the board, Rockefeller was also consistently one of the largest annual donors. And as mentioned earlier, it was Rockefeller that led the transition of the council in the 1970s as it began to integrate more of the new rich. Rockefeller was the bridge between the old moneyed families of the US, like his own Rockefeller family, the DuPont family, the Mellon family, and the new financial elite who were much more Zionist in their orientation. Carla A. Hills grew up in Beverly Hills, where her mother was a prominent socialite and her father was the president of the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce. A law graduate, she served in the Ford and Bush administrations, and while in her role in the CFR, she had also been director of major corporations like American Insurance Group, AOL Time Warner, and Chevron, and has served on the International Advisory Board of JP Morgan Chase, Coca-Cola, Rolls-Royce, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So again, you see the kind of revolving door that exists between Wall Street, the Council on Foreign Relations, and high government positions. Robert E. Rubin was the co-chair with Carla Hills from 2007 to 2017. Like many others in the CFR, he started in corporate law. He served 26 years at Goldman Sachs, eventually serving as their co-chair from 1990 to 92. And when Clinton was elected president in 92, Rubin was chosen to lead the newly formed National Economic Council and became one of the key formulators of the North American Free Trade Agreement. In late 1994, President Clinton appointed Rubin to be the nation's 70th Secretary of the Treasury, a post he resigned in 1999 and was immediately replaced by one of his protégés, Larry Summers, who is also a CFR member. The current chair is David Rubenstein, who is a billionaire who is the co-founder of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest private equity firms. The current president is Richard Haass, who worked for Secretary of State Colin Powell in the Bush administration and was Director of Policy Planning for the US State Department from 2001 to 2003 during the lead-up to the Iraq War. Other prominent figures include Morris Greenberg, who was Vice Chair from 1994 to 2002 and has been the Honorary Vice Chair from 2002 to the present. Greenberg is a billionaire who worked in corporate law for AIG and is the current CEO of Star International, a financial services company. Now, given the staggering influence by the CFR, it's incredible that the organization is rarely discussed in matters of American foreign policy. Someone only exposed to mainstream media would hardly know the organization exists, but this isn't actually surprising when we see that the same corporate interests represented on the board of the CFR also dominate ownership of the American media. If the council has a staggering influence in the halls of American government, its influence is no less on the media. For example, the New York Times, which pushed heavily for the war in Iraq and other hawkish foreign policy aims, has long had a close relationship with the CFR. At least 3 members of the Sulzberger Oaks owning family of the Times have been members of the council. Rupert Murdoch, the CEO of News Corp, which owns Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, is also a CFR member. The News Corp board also has a number of CFR members, while Roger Ailes, who was the former CEO of Fox News, was also a member, as is Adi Ignatius, editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review. Other prominent journalists include CNN's Fareed Zakaria and Peter Bergen, who serves as their national security analyst. Katie Couric, Dan Rather, and Diane Sawyer have also been members of the CFR. Unsurprisingly, it's extremely rare to find a major publication or news network take a position on American foreign policy that violates the declared interests of the CFR. How the CFR has shaped American foreign policy since the Second World War, including recent events like the Iraq War, can be the subject for another video. For now, it can be recognized that the CFR is the most powerful organization of its kind in the world, that it shapes US foreign policy, and that it shapes it specifically in the interests of the bankers and the oligarchs who have turned the United States into a tool to expand their wealth and power. And as I mentioned, how specifically they've done that is something I hope to cover in a future video. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, subscribe, and take care.